you have a mandate from God to raise your child to the best of your ability, right?
Yeah.
That's spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally.
Our interests are going to align at certain points. Enough of them, apparently, for Paul and even Jesus in the Gospels to say, yeah, you're going to have to play ball at some points.
The question that researchers and, people who are a little bit more nervous are asking, they're saying like, is the cure potentially worse than the disease, right?
Good day to everyone. Welcome to KT Kingdom Thinking, where the thoughts are being thought about in the kingdom.
Always.
How you doing today, Josh?
Good, man. How are you?
Doing good. I got some hot topics for you.
Okay, I'm ready for the topic of hotness.
In the newest saga, that is the discussion about the vaccine, we now have the infants in the mix. So we knew this was coming eventually.
Yeah, 5 to 11, right? That range.
5 to 11-year-olds. There's like votes being had by experts in the field. This vote was anonymous by this group of experts. They're saying, yeah, we should do it. So this is going to be the new tug of war to be had here. And I'm particularly interested in a few things. On the one hand, what should be a response if and when this becomes an imperative, when this becomes a mandate? What could that tap into? Public schools? Public spheres?
Yeah, public life, right?
Public life. What if you can't send your kids to school if they're not vaccinated? Things like that. And what are some of the pros and cons? So let's try to shed some light into that. What do you think?
Yeah, so I know that from a biblical perspective, right, for parents, the whole goal in that conversation is to you have a mandate from God to raise your child to the best of your ability, right?
Yeah.
That's spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally. And so for me, this conversation has happened a lot, around youth group families that are asking, hey, what do you think we should do?
Yep.
And the first conversation is I'm not a doctor, right? But from a biblical perspective, what do you think the answer is? And so this has been very interesting to me because I think it's worth having an actual conversation in good faith here, and not just assume that people who don't want to get the vaccine or are afraid to get the vaccine or whatever, or have questions, are just stupid or anti-vax or whatever, right? So kind of clearing the air on that from the beginning, I think, is going to be particularly important to have a dialogue that's not incendiary in nature and giving people the benefit of the doubt. And so I think this is pretty important. So we've got some kind of stats and stuff that we collected. And what I want to do is I can take you through some of these things and talk through a little bit of what people who are saying this is a good thing are the pros, and some people who are a little bit nervous are some of the cons around that stuff. So do you have any thoughts about this from a biblical perspective before we kind of analyze some of the data?
So some of the biblical principles that might come to mind as relevant or important here would continue to be the tension between a good faith willingness to play ball with the government without a full-blown submission that doesn't ask questions, and also without an initial withdrawal from, right? So what does that look like? What does it mean? Okay, our interests are going to align at certain points, enough of them apparently for Paul and even Jesus in the Gospels to say, yeah, you're going to have to play ball at some points.
Right.
So that being said, I do think that the two most important ones would be fight the temptation to just withdraw, take your ball home and say, okay, I'm going to create a new community where I'm no longer part of public life.
Yeah.
So fight that. Fight also God put the government here for a reason. Whatever they say, we have to do.
Yeah.
But also take responsibility for the rearing of your children.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the difficulty that we're trying to balance.
Yeah, so this is the first biblical mandate, is to actually probably dig into the data, right, and find out what's going on, right? We have an ethical responsibility, not just as pastors, but as churchgoers, irrespective of how old we are, to pay attention to this data as much as we can, because this is going to be a topic of conversation in our life for the next several years moving forward, right?
Yeah.
And more so, this sets a precedence for the next time something like this happens, which is going to invariably be, not a long time from now. So let's talk some top line stats just to be aware of real quick. So Pfizer and BioNTech, they had their phase 3 clinical trial, which started actually last July, where they got a bunch of participants who were actually 12 and over. And there was 2,259 participants between the ages of 12 and 15, and 754 between 16 and 17, which automatically makes me feel like, it's not a terribly big sample size, right, to kind of roll out a vaccine for a population of 28 million people. So something to be aware of.
Right.
And so
none of those people were under 12.
Right. And so they're using that study, it seems like, to kind of move down, right, in some of as kind of like a saying, okay, it was okay for the 12 to 17-year-old range, so now let's look at the study that we've done for the 5 to 11-year-old range as well. So it's like, all right, we passed that first trial, right? So we saw that it was good there, so let's do an even smaller version of the adult dose for children in 5 to 11 and see how that reacts now.
Okay.
So Pfizer also had a clinical trial where they looked at another 2,268 children who were in that 5 to 11-year-old range.
Okay.
And so they actually got what was a 10 microgram vaccine dose, which is 1/3 of the adult dose.
Yeah.
And then they got their second one 21 days apart. So a 3-week spread in between those two doses instead of a 2-week spread, right, that the adults get. Now, in the main clinical trial, they found that it had a 90% effectiveness rate against symptomatic COVID-19. And then there were no new safety problems that were identified in the company's studies. There were no cases of heart inflammation that were observed in the main studies. But there's a problem here, right? The inflamed heart is called myocarditis, and in the larger studies that they were using, that was about a 1 in 9,000 number of people who were getting myocarditis. Well, the studies that they've used for 5 and 11 and 12 to 17 were only about 2,300 people apiece. So if that was, you're not even using enough people to get to that sample size, right, where that could be potentially problematic of seeing somebody come in with an enlarged heart. So this is a thing that people who are leery and hesitant of are already pointing to and saying, if the sample size isn't even big enough for that, then should we even want to go along with this, because we don't know if that there is a certain threshold of participatory numbers that you get to before the problems start revealing themselves, right? So, do we want to roll out something before we can see that potentially go off, in a bigger thing? So what do you think of all of this thus far?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, specifically because I think a lot of the battle over the statistics and the data is so curved and so what's the word for it?
It's framed in a very particular manner, depending on who's doing the talking.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And so that's tricky to me because I think about the sample size, I think about the effectiveness of it, and one of the things not mentioned here, but that we were talking about is, well, how much has COVID actually been an issue for kids who are 5 through 11 years old?
Yeah.
How relevant should that be?
Yep.
I think there's reason enough to understand at this point that for seniors, people with pre-existing conditions, older folk, there's very real vulnerabilities there. And I think that has more substance to it in the conversation for vaccinations and adults and things like that. We don't know.
Right.
There's a lot we don't know here. And how much has COVID affected children?
So we can talk about that, right? Okay. We'll kind of move into that part of the conversation. So COVID in and of itself has a pretty high recovery rate, right? Okay. It's an over 99% recovery rate for the population just as a whole.
Overall.
But it's when you get into those subcategories of age and things like that you were talking about where, it's like over 80, you're pretty much going to die if you get it mid 65 and above, right? And so the younger you get, the more
resilient you are to it.
The less pervasive it is in your world. So if you're an infant, if you're under 5, right, you actually are more likely to die from the flu than you are from COVID-19, right? Wow. Like that level. So that's the level, again, 5 and under only, not everybody. Yeah. But the idea with this, Marty McCary wrote, who's a doctor at Johns Hopkins, right, a researcher, wrote that the study that he and his team did, they found that there were 0 kids had died who didn't have a pre-existing condition, right? And so this is what's so deadly about COVID, right? There's the fact that it is a comorbidity killer, right? It's different than like hit by a bus, right? Which is going to be the cause of death. Right. COVID is far more likely to
latch onto something
if you're
else.
Overweight, if you have leukemia or whatever, right? And so what they saw was, and this is where Marty McCary, who's been pretty vocal in their dislike for the idea of vaccinating children, right? They were talking about this specific number, 335, right? And that was the number of kids who were under 18 in total who had died. And so you get this like population of America is like 28-ish million people, somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah.
So you're at 335 out of 28 million, right?
Yeah.
It might be a little bit higher now, like around 600 or something, like all in with people who have pre-existing conditions and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So you're looking at an infinitesimal percentage, right? And so the question that researchers and, people who are a little bit more nervous are asking, they're saying like, is the cure potentially worse than the disease, right? Is it worth going into this very literal, unknown experience of not understanding like the value of how our kids' bodies are going to react to it? Like, because they're still growing, they're still changing, they're still maturing.
Right.
Like, should we risk that when we have very clear evidence already, demonstrated evidence, that if your kid gets COVID, it's pretty likely nothing's going to happen to them, right? Especially if they're healthy in every other respect. And so this is the intersection of where people are fearful, right? Even people who don't, who are older, maybe they don't have kids, but maybe you're 20 and you're watching this, right? And you're like, I'm pretty healthy, like as is, and I don't want to get it. Right. Should it even be a thing for me? Right. And so this applies, right, to like a whole strata of people, not just parents watching this video, right?
Or the kids.
Yeah, or the kids. And so the idea, with that being like, what is the value in that? And so people are very seriously asking that question, and I think it's something that's worth really digging into.
Pondering, yeah.
Particularly because the goal of zero COVID is not going to be something that we can ever get to as a society, right? Like there will always be
cases.
Yeah, it's like somebody's going to get COVID. Somebody's always going to have it. And so when we get into the mindset of like we have to stamp this disease out entirely, it's like, you know how many diseases we've eradicated as a species?
Probably not very many.
One. The idea is like, so it's an interesting kind of thought to me. And so...
so where do you land on it?
Yeah, so I've got a 2-year-old, almost 3-year-old.
Almost 3-year-old.
Yeah, and I was talking to our pediatrician about this literally this week and we were talking about the value of whether or not we should get her the vaccine. And so her perspective was saying like it's a smaller version of the adult dose, which we know is an mRNA vaccine, right? Which means that like
they're not injecting DNA into you.
And it's not this weird thing to get her sick, right? Like it's based on technology or studies, right, that are much older. They didn't just develop the vaccine out of thin air, right? This had been a well-established study and kind of way to build vaccines that had been more than 20 years old, right, and all that stuff. And so it's just a smaller version of that. So we know it's safe, right? Like empirically we know and we understand that it's safe. But I'm always like weird about the flu shot, right?
Yeah.
Just for my kid, because it's like 33% effective of some non-viral strain, and it's like, so it's not quite the same thing, right? But it's like injecting my kid with anything that's not technically necessary makes me go like, meh, I don't know.
Like, do I have to?
Yeah, and so my wonderment and my wife and I, we've been talking about this, is like we don't necessarily have an answer where we feel like yet because our daughter's in a school where she can stay in that school unvaccinated, and it goes through like 6 or 7 years old right now, and it may grow as she grows out, and so it's like, okay, well, we could technically just hold her back, and then we would have 4 years of data to analyze by the time we actually had to face that decision, right? And so it's, it's the question of why do today what you can put off until tomorrow. Yeah. There's something that is looming very heavily in our conversations right now, because it's like 4 more years of actually lived out data would be fine. Now, if the doctor is like, no, you really need to get this because of something that pops up, like my wife and I both have the vaccine, we're both believers in the vaccine, and things like that. And so we don't have any problems with it personally. Yeah. And, it's like getting boost. I got the J&J one, and I got a text pretty quickly from LA County. They're like, yo, you need your booster pretty quick, bro. And so I think our first round, my first round was only like 63% effective against the vaccine or something like that. I was like,
you got the Rogue one?
And no, I got the one that people were freaking out about, like the thing that it was like hurting women or something like that. That 6 case out of the 7 million people that got it. So, I'm a little bit iffy on it right now. I haven't come to a decision. I don't have a problem with giving it to her, but I don't want to give it to her just because it's out and people are saying you should do it.
Correct.
Right?
And you don't feel like you have to right now.
No.
But here's the issue. What if it comes down to the point where you don't have that prerogative anymore?
I'm a position where I can afford fiscally to not have to deal with the consequences of that, right?
Meaning what? Private school?
Yeah, I can put her in private school all through her education and I would be fine, right?
Okay.
Like I can make those sacrifices. I have that type of freedom and flexibility in my job. And so So it is. I want to be very aware of that privilege that I have that a lot of families do not, and I think it's important to state that up front. And so as a result of that, it feels dangerous
you can't speak
to me.
into it as well?
No, I feel like I'm going to argue that you shouldn't that it's not something that should be compulsory for the life of children.
Because it's not life and death for you.
And
financially.
And it's not life and death for me, and it's also not life and death for kids, like very clearly.
Correct.
Kids 18 and under.
Right. So I think
it feels foolish to make it compulsory to me.
Do you think it's going to go that way?
I don't see how it doesn't go that way, at least in blue states. Yeah. Like, honestly. Yeah. You know, it feels like to me this is going to come down to a blue state, red state conversation.
Dang. Yeah.
So, I don't know.
I'm kind of, I don't have kids yet. I have dogs, but I don't think they're going to get COVID, probably.
Probably not, yeah. Unless they eat a bat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I am leery of this. There's a lot of people that I know, converse with, who are very, very, very leery of this.
Yeah.
And so they're either going to, move to Texas, move to Florida. But the ones that are staying in California, it's like, okay, so what are we going to do?
Right.
Do you just have to play ball?
Yeah.
If so, what would be a Christian principle that we can extrapolate if you're in a place where it's almost coercion? What do you think?
You either have to resist or you have to jump in. I think if you were to make the decision to jump in, it doesn't hurt you, because I do think that the data will bear out that the COVID vaccine is not dangerous for children.
Gotcha.
Because the data is very clearly bearing that out for all of adults who are, the millions and tens of millions of adults who are vaccinated.
Yeah.
So I anticipate the reaction will be the same for children.
Yeah, so kids are going to be dying from this.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be a big deal.
In principle, though.
Yeah, so
you
principally
either have to
speaking,
move to Texas or
you
Florida.
got to move or play ball, man.
Yeah.
It's
increasingly becoming that.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think? To some of our younger viewers, maybe some of our young adult viewers as well, who are thinking about this, and parents as well. What are some points that you think are important to consider as this? And what do you think about that? What we think is going to be the case, play ball or move out of state? Let us know. Check us out on the app, on the JUCE app, and leave us a comment. See you next time on KT Kingdom Thinking, where the thoughts are had about the kingdom.